Tonight, we're looking at 30 rare Old West photos with stories history tried to hide. Some expose the truth behind the cowboy myth. Some reveal the brutal cost of frontier life. And some show how photography itself helped create the Wild West legend. By the end of this video, the Old West may not look heroic anymore. It may just look human. 1. The saloon girl who was actually the boss. This portrait looks like a typical dance hall beauty. But many women in frontier saloons were far more than decoration. They managed room rentals, handled money, kept track of regular customers, and sometimes controlled the entire business behind the scenes. In a violent town full of drifters and gamblers, survival demanded intelligence, not glamour. 2. Cowboys were mostly exhausted laborers. Old photos of real cowboys don't show movie stars. They show tired men with worn clothes and hard faces. Most cowboys were underpaid ranch workers doing brutal, physical labor for months at a time. They slept outside, smelled like cattle, and lived on poor food. The cowboy myth promised freedom. The reality was dangerous work and low pay. 3. Sheriffs didn't always keep the peace. A sheriff's portrait could look noble, but frontier law was messy. Some lawmen were brave. Others were feared bullies with a badge. In many towns, justice depended on alliances, money, and intimidation. A formal portrait might suggest order, but it couldn't show the corruption, gambling debts, or violence hiding behind the badge. 4. Childhood on the frontier wasn't romantic. A child standing outside a mining shack might look like part of a simple pioneer life, but many frontier children grew up in grinding poverty. They worked young, went without proper schooling, and lived among sickness, alcohol abuse, and constant danger. For poor families, the West wasn't opportunity. It was just a harsher version of survival. 5. Native families were turned into frontier images. Some of the most famous Old West photos of native families were presented as timeless portraits, but many were taken during forced displacement and cultural destruction. In some cases, photographers staged scenes to make native people look more authentic for outsiders. The image looked noble. The reality behind it was loss, coercion, and trauma. 6. Outlaw photos helped build their legend. Outlaws understood the power of a photograph. A revolver, a hard stare, a tilted hat. These details could turn a wanted criminal into a folk hero. Sometimes the photo became more famous than the crimes themselves. The public saw rebellion and mystery. What the image often hid was fear, hunger, and a man constantly running for his life. 7. Saloons were dirtier than the movies show. A polished saloon photo can be misleading. Real frontier saloons were often filthy, smoky, loud, and packed with men who hadn't washed in days. Whiskey, spit, mud, blood, and tobacco covered the floors. The piano and fancy lamps in some images tell only part of the story. The smell of a real saloon probably ruined the fantasy instantly. 8. Women in black were often living with constant grief. A stiff portrait of a frontier woman in black may not look dramatic, but it often carried a heavy story. Disease, childbirth, accidents, and violence killed people constantly in the West. Some women lost husbands, children, or siblings in quick succession and were still expected to carry on. These weren't just portraits. Sometimes they were quiet records of grief. 9. Calm town streets could turn violent fast. A peaceful-looking Western street photo can hide a dangerous town. Behind those storefronts were gambling dens, saloons, debt disputes, theft, and drunken violence. A town that looked calm in daylight could turn deadly after dark. One frozen image can never show how unstable frontier life really was. 10. Buffalo hunter photos captured a disaster. Pictures of buffalo hunters posing beside hides or bones were once seen as proof of progress, but they also recorded a catastrophe. The destruction of buffalo herds devastated native communities that depended on them for food, clothing, and trade. What looked like success to hunters looked like cultural destruction to everyone, forced to live with the consequences. 11. Frontier medicine was terrifying. An old photo of a frontier doctor may look respectable, but medicine in the West was primitive and often hopeless. A gunshot, infected wound, or bad fall could easily become fatal. Doctors traveled long distances with limited tools and no sterile conditions. A portrait suggested authority. The truth was that even basic treatment could be a gamble. 12. Family portraits often hid poverty. One of the strangest things about frontier photography is how formal people looked. Despite living in chaos, families would save money for one clean outfit and one respectable portrait. It was a performance, a chance to look stable even if they were drowning in debt, hunger, or illness. The camera captured dignity, not the truth of daily life. 13. Frontier glamour could hide exploitation. Some saloon and brothel portraits were later romanticized as images of glamorous, Old West women. But prostitution on the frontier was often tied to poverty, coercion, and violence. A woman with jewelry and a confident pose may have been living a life shaped by addiction, abuse, or desperation. The photo sold a fantasy. Reality was often brutal. 14. The gunsmith sold to everyone. In frontier towns, gunsmiths and hardware dealers didn't care much about morality. They sold to sheriffs, ranchers, gamblers, drifters, and sometimes the very outlaws the sheriff was hunting. A neat shop photo might look like order and craftsmanship, but the truth was simpler. If you had money, you could probably leave armed. 15. School photos left out the hard part. A schoolhouse picture makes frontier life look wholesome, but many children only attended seasonally because they were needed for ranch work, mining camps, or survival at home. Schools were often tiny, underfunded, and surrounded by adult problems like disease, poverty, and violence. The smiling class photo left out almost everything that mattered. 16. Railroad workers built the West and were forgotten. When people think of the Old West, they think cowboys and outlaws. But railroad workers shaped the region just as much. They lived in rough camps, worked dangerous jobs, and were treated as disposable labor. Camp photos show more than expansion. They show the human cost of building the West. 17. Gambling tables could ruin lives. A poker table makes for a great Western image. But gambling halls were often scenes of humiliation, debt, and violence. One bad night could destroy a man financially. A cheating accusation or unpaid bet could lead to a fight or a shooting. In photographs, it looks civilized. In reality, it could be one of the most dangerous places in town. 18. Some cowboys borrowed their image. Not every cowboy portrait showed real success. Hats, guns, jackets, and even watches could be borrowed for the photo. Looking tough or wealthy mattered, especially in a place where reputation meant everything. A confident studio portrait might hide a man who owned almost nothing and drifted from one ranch job to the next. 19. Frontier. Justice could mean mob violence. Not all punishment happened in court. In some towns, justice meant a crowd, a rope, and almost no due process. A rare photo near a gallows or town square can hide the ugliness of vigilante rule. Frontier communities talked about law and order, but fear often moved faster than the legal system ever could. 20. Covered wagons were not a symbol of freedom for everyone. The covered wagon became one of the great symbols of westward expansion. But for many families, the journey west meant sickness, exhaustion, infant death, and financial ruin. The wagon in the photograph became part of a national myth. For the people inside it, it could mean uncertainty, hunger, and loss. 21. Frontier photography wasn't always honest. Some famous Western images were staged. Props were moved. Weapons were added. People were positioned to fit a certain story. Native subjects were sometimes photographed in ways that matched Eastern fantasies rather than reality. Even in the Old West, photography could lie, not by inventing people, but by inventing meaning. 22. Motherhood was one of the frontier's greatest risks. A woman holding a baby in a doorway may look like a quiet domestic scene, but childbirth in the Old West was incredibly dangerous. Limited medical care, poor nutrition, and isolation made pregnancy a terrifying risk. A family photo might hide buried infants, repeated pregnancies, and physical exhaustion that never made it into the heroic frontier story. 23. Black cowboys were erased from the myth. The West was far more diverse than movies ever admitted. A significant number of real cowboys were black, Mexican, or native. Yet the popular legend centered almost entirely on white gunslingers. Rare photos of black cowboys matter because they correct a myth that lasted for generations. The Old West was never as simple as Hollywood wanted it to be. 24. Outlaws lived in constant fear. Some outlaw portraits make these men look fearless, but life on the run was miserable. Poor food, stolen horses, infected wounds, sleepless nights, betrayal, and paranoia wore people down quickly. The hard stare in a photo doesn't show a man waking at every sound, wondering if the next sunrise would be his last. 25. Chinese laborers helped build the West. Chinese workers were essential to frontier expansion, especially in railroad construction, yet mainstream Western stories pushed them to the margins. They did dangerous work while facing brutal discrimination. In some towns, they were economically useful and socially despised at the same time. Their photos reveal a far more complicated West than the cowboy myth ever allowed. 26. Churches stood next to vice. A church in an old West town might look like a symbol of morality in a rough land. But those same towns often had brothels, saloons, gambling rooms, corruption, and violence just a few steps away. Religion existed in the West, but it existed beside vice, not in place of it. That contradiction is part of what made frontier towns so unstable. At 27. Many homesteaders failed. Not everyone who moved west found land and freedom. Drought, debt, bad soil, illness, and isolation crushed countless families. A proud homesteader portrait might have been taken just before everything collapsed. The dream of independence was real, but so was the failure that followed many families to the grave. 28. Most frontier deaths were quiet, not legendary. The Old West killed people constantly, but not always in dramatic gunfights. Travelers died on trails. Children died of fever. Women died in childbirth. Workers died in mines, blizzards, and accidents. For every famous shootout remembered in legend, there were countless quieter deaths that history barely recorded at all. 29. Many men worked their whole lives and died poor. The myth of the West promised reinvention, but some men spent their entire lives working frontier land and still died with nothing. No ranch, no fortune, no legacy, just damaged hands, worn clothes, and a body broken by labor. The Old West created legends, but it also created a lot of forgotten men. 30. The final truth behind these photos. That may be the strangest thing about rare Old West photographs. At first glance, they look like evidence of freedom, rebellion, and adventure. But once you understand the stories behind them, they reveal something else entirely. Hard labor, grief, exploitation, erased communities, and ordinary people trapped inside a myth bigger than themselves. And maybe that's the real story of the Wild West.